Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this latest installment in the Virtual Access series from the Downtown Seattle Association. My name's Felix Bonnell, and today we're talking about the transformation of Seattle's downtown waterfront. This effort is many years in the making, and it involves many projects and organizations, and there's significant and exciting work ahead, of course. But the end result, parts of which we're already seeing in places on the downtown waterfront, is a cohesive and coherent design that makes the most of a unique space in one of downtown Seattle's greatest assets. Its historic, timeless, and priceless setting on Elliott Bay, and that enduring natural connection to salt water. Indigenous people lived and breathed that connection and respected it for thousands of years. And somehow explorers like Captain Vancouver in the 18th century and even the U.S. Navy in the 1840s pretty much missed how perfect this spot is. It wasn't until settlers from the Midwest landed at what's now West Seattle 172 years ago, this past Monday, that modern Seattle began to take shape. And even those early settlers didn't figure out Elliott Bay was the place to build a city until the following February. And for the 100 or so years that followed, it was all about sawmills and railroads, shipyards, and the mosquito fleet. And who could forget the viaduct? And in those viaduct years, the downtown Seattle waterfront of the 20th century inspired writers like Jack Kerouac and John Steinbeck, who both took note of the heavy industry and commerce alongside that natural beauty. And now we're in an entirely different era that promises an exciting and sustainable future for what's transformed from the city's loading dock to its living room and front porch. We have a terrific panel this morning to talk about this, so kudos to DSA staff for another great job recruiting people who are making so much of this happen. Panel includes Marshall Foster, who has one of the coolest jobs in town, director of Seattle Center. He has a rich history building public-private partnerships, having worked for the city of Seattle since 2015 in a variety of capacities. He headed up the city's Office of Waterfront and Civic Projects for 8 years, before becoming the interim director of Seattle Center last January and then getting the permanent nod in September. Beginning earlier this year, Seattle Center began managing operations, maintenance, and public safety for several areas of the waterfront, including Pier 58 and Pier 62. Leslie Koch is a consultant for the Elliott Bay Connections Project, which we'll hear a lot more about today. She's a national leader in public-private partnerships, from her early career at Microsoft through her tenure creating civic spaces. Leslie's been an innovator with equal focus on vision and execution. She led the transformation of Governor's Island in New York City from 2006 to 2016, and the development of the Paramount Performing Arts Center at Ground Zero, which opened recently. Leslie now serves as an advisor to philanthropists developing public-private partnerships, including the Elliott Bay Connections Project. And Joy Shigaki is president and CEO of the nonprofit Friends of Waterfront Seattle. She joined them in September 2022. Prior to that, she spent 5 years with the Golden Gate National Parks Conservancy and 10 years leading development efforts for various New York City-based organizations. Over the course of her long career working in nonprofit, government, and community-based organizations around the country, Joy has led fundraising for capital campaigns and worked within public-private partnerships on parks and a range of civic efforts. Now, we have some questions we prepared in advance, and we'll get to audience questions as we can throughout the program. As mentioned earlier, I want to encourage everyone to use the chat function to pose questions at any time during the conversation. We'll monitor those or try to work those into the conversation flow wherever we can. Now, if you've attended these virtual access sessions before, you know we always start out with some data points, and today is no exception. Okay, DSA's Downtown Recovery Dashboard notes nearly 2.4 million visitors came to downtown Seattle in October 2023. This represents about 93% of the visitors seen here in October 2019. That's really good news now and an encouraging trend for the future. Down along the waterfront, Pier 62 has welcomed more than 1 million people since it opened in autumn of 2020. And estimates project that 15 million people will visit Waterfront Park every year once it's operational. And once it's completed, the new Waterfront Park and Elliott Bay Connections projects will create 50 acres of connected public space spanning about 3.5 miles. All right. Now, to get things started, I thought it would make sense to do kind of like those data points, to do a little kind of a waterfront transformation 101. Talk about what these new projects are, what's going on down there now, what the current status of things are in 2023. Seems like the best person to start us off with that is Marshall Foster.
Hey, Felix. Thank you.
Of course.
Yeah, it's great to be with you all. Thank you so much for organizing to DSA. And yeah, I'll share a few points just about the overall history. I know I'm sure a lot of people on the call this morning lived a lot of this with us, so some of it will be familiar. Really, a lot of what drove kind of opened up the opportunity for this was the decision to remove the viaduct. And you mentioned that earlier. There was a critical moment where the governor, the mayor, and the county executive came together around the decision on how to remove the viaduct, which for the city of Seattle really opened the door to that moment to reclaim Alaskan Way and the waterfront as our front porch instead of our loading dock, as you put it, Felix. That kicked off, that happened in 2009 with the leadership of Governor Gregoire and Mayor Nichols and Executive Constantine. That really kicked off the creation of the Waterfront Seattle program. For those who are in Seattle, you know, ever since then, the city's been who were in Seattle at that moment, that was really when the city wholeheartedly embraced the idea of reclaiming this as a public park, but also recognizing that this was not a passive, traditional waterfront park like you see in a lot of cities, that this was a working urban waterfront with commerce, with the ferries, with all the commercial life, and that was part of how we were going to design it to be an incredible park that kind of celebrated the rich urban place that it fits, that the role that it plays in the city. We created a civic committee that was very important, and its legacy lives on and is very active in Friends of Waterfront Seattle and other organizations. That committee became the leadership that created, with the city team, the Waterfront Seattle vision. And that culminated in 2012, 2013 with the James Corner design, which was developed in partnership with pretty much every corner of the waterfront community, larger city engagement. And that, to this day, is very much the blueprint for what's getting built. A lot of times you look at pictures of projects and you compare it to what's getting built. I think what you will see is this is very much has honed to the original vision. And so in 2014, the city created the Office of the Waterfront and Civic Projects with the singular purpose of executing that project. To the point about Leslie's career, you know, linking vision and execution and making those two totally seamless. And that's what the city has done. And now we're at a point where you're seeing the final pieces of the new waterfront being built. You're going to see major elements open over the course of 24, completion in 25. And then the last piece is the new chapter, which I'm very excited about now, with Seattle Center stepping into the role to partner with Friends of Waterfront Seattle in ensuring that this place is extraordinarily well managed and maintained, that it is welcoming, that it is safe, that we have incredible community gathering and belonging that really anchors people in a sense of place on the waterfront. Whether you live downtown or you were coming in from Rainier Beach or Lake City or wherever, that you feel very welcome and safe. So that is absolutely the focus now, is both finishing the project and teeing up the operations to be successful. And I'm super excited and proud that Seattle Center gets to step into that. So we're right in the first few months. We're still figuring it out, but it's looking good thus far.
Yeah, we might come back to that. Seattle. I want to ask that question about that, sort of how Seattle Center, the analog for Seattle Center as a campus with multiple, you know, resident organizations, and what the waterfront might look like in the future. But before we do that, Joy, I mean, your group, you're activating that space down there at Pier 62, and sort of you can kind of give us a status report of what's actually new down there, what's going on the waterfront in, you know, here it is November 2023.
Yeah, thanks, Felix, and thanks so much for the invitation. Just to kind of piggyback a little bit on Marshall's point, one of the pieces of ensuring that this park is cared for and that it really has the kind of activation and centering of community to be sure that that sense of belonging was the creation of this nonprofit in 2012 by city ordinance. And the first executive director started in late 2013 to really be focusing on the fundraising to be able to partner with philanthropy to be able to invest in this $781 million project, but also to be the organization that's really responsible for programming and activation. And so what you can begin to see actually on the waterfront, if you come down to Pier 62, it's the first part of the park that opened in the throes of COVID, the fall of 2020. Friends really began taking on the task of asking the question, you can build a place, but who is it really meant for? And how do you do placemaking that really centers belonging, safety, and joy in that? Not all communities feel that sense of belonging in public space. And I think one of our commitments, along with the city's commitments, is really how do we center BIPOC communities and marginalized communities who often do not feel that sense of safety and belonging, which really I think is a testament to all the incredible what our city stands for, and even more what we need in terms of bringing communities together. So our programming work is really centered by partnering with community organizations, artists, curators. This past summer, we had over 100 activations, from a Bollywood dance class to Tai Chi to a hip hop 50th event to a block party. The point was to actually have people see themselves in community and create relevant programming, but also to bring joy and beauty to the connection of this place. So you heard there are 1 million people that came down, because you can go on a cold day like today and you have the most extraordinary views of the Sailor Sea and have moments of quiet and respite. But we also wanted to do this placemaking so that when the full 20 acres open, that people feel themselves and see themselves in the waterfront. And it's also just a statement about what this park is going to be for our city, of bringing people and converging and bringing people together in a way that's going to be this extraordinary destination. Tourists will come. It's going to be an extraordinary destination for so many reasons, being downtown, adjacent to Pike Place Market, coming to the new Ocean Pavilion, which is the Seattle Aquarium's a new facility. But it's about locals rediscovering our waterfront and having incredible joy and pride in the experience. So more to come. There are fire pits on the waterfront happening this winter. We're not programming to a high degree, but I do think there's a question around how do we do more programming in the winter? And then you're going to begin seeing also more activation moving into 2024 as a lead up to 2025, which is the full park opening, and really celebrating this very, very audacious project that's taken a very long time. But I also think those audacious projects are worth the wait, and Friends will continue to be that fundraiser to do the work to care for this place in partnership with community. We will also be doing that programming and activation and stewardship and operational partnership with the Seattle Center. And so we're really pleased to be able to be that player in the room and continue to elevate partnership.
Yeah, I mean, and no one entity could pull this off by themselves in terms of this, the acreage and the mileage of space and the diversity of the organizations that are there and that will be there. So it makes sense that there's this, and the fact it will take time to roll out. If this whole project dropped from the sky overnight, no one would know how to use it. It feels like it's evolving, and there's part of the appeal of a project that rolls out over many years. And this isn't just some excuse for it taking so long. Is this notion that it evolves and that people understand and learn what it is and come to make it. Same way Seattle Center evolved after the World's Fair. It became this thing that everybody uses for very many different purposes. It seems like the waterfront is playing out in the same way. In terms of all the different projects involved, because I think when people talk about the waterfront, people who don't pay super close attention, they see the construction projects connecting Pike Place Market to the waterfront. They see some of the changes at Pier 62, but there's so many different projects along there. Leslie, would it be good for you to kind of explain Elliott Bay Connections and how all these different pieces will eventually fit together?
Sure, I would be happy to. It's great to be here. We're partnered with DSA on doing this project, so it's wonderful that they're hosting all of us. And really, we're coming, on, with what Marshall and Joy both described, right? So the idea here, a group of philanthropists came together, sort of inspired by that history, and that history, Marshall said, started with the viaduct. I mean, some could say it even started with Olmsted, right? And that Seattle has on the lake, right, this incredible sense of connected parks, right, that are integral to the identity of Seattle. And in fact, the Olmsted brothers wanted to do a park on Elliott Bay that never happened. So that idea of connecting the city of Seattle and the people who live in Seattle and the region to this body of water, right, is something that's been an aspiration for a really long time. And that was very inspiring to the philanthropists, as well as the long public-private partnership that Joy and Marshall just talked about, that goes back, to when the viaduct came down. And in fact, going back to that early public input process, right, and in terms of what people were looking for, and the sort of number one and number two things that people wanted was to touch the water and to experience green. And so what we thought about was, how can we build on the work that's already happening, and looking at that whole waterfront. And there were a couple of places where the addition of private resources we thought could really help achieve that vision, that I think people in Seattle have been longing for decades, really, honestly. People talk about how people complained about the viaduct, right? I lived in Seattle for many years, right? As soon as it went up, right? It wasn't just waiting for it to come down. So the idea of Elliott Bay Connections is building on, just as Joy said, if you imagine being at Pier 62 and looking north, you see Alaskan Way, and there's an abandoned trolley track. And so this idea, which actually came out of an incredible civic effort, Lake to Bay, a number of years ago, about how do you build connection between the anchors that are civic anchors for Seattle. And one of those anchors is the one that the city's building right now, Waterfront Park, but two of them, right? One is more than 50 years. I can tell you exactly how old it is. I'm the same age as the Seattle Center. So 61 years old. And then the Olympic Sculpture Park. So the first piece of Elliott Bay Connections is literally a connection, right? Which is building a greenway along those city blocks, 3/4 of a mile that stretches from Pier 62 to Broad Street and the beginning of Olympic Sculpture Park, and using not the roadbed, but actually those old trolley tracks and the sidewalk on the side to make something that's really designed for what we call recreational bicyclists, right? People who are with their kids, with their friends, people in wheelchairs with strollers, walking, right? This idea of sort of continuing that walk. And then, of course, you get to the Olympic Sculpture Park, which, if you in Seattle don't realize, is perhaps the most spectacular urban art park, certainly in the country, if not the world. It is unbelievable. And just north of that are two park sites, one owned by the city of Seattle, one of our partners, and one owned by the port, right? Another partner. And those are, of course, Myrtle Edwards and Centennial Parks. And they have spectacular locations, and they're 16 acres in essence of green. But in a world where there are always scarce resources on the public side, there hasn't been the ability to invest in, where do you sit, bring that furnishings up to date, are the paths well maintained? Couldn't there be more native plantings? And one of the beautiful potential features in Myrtle Edwards is these two coves that already exist. And the idea of sort of taking a page from the Olympic Sculpture Park and restoring those coves, again, so we can all reach down and touch the water. So the premise of Elliott Bay Connections is really building on all the work that I think Marshall and Joy embody, right? Representing organizations and decades of work by citizens, public officials, and then completing that connection and that vision. So exactly as you said, when Waterfront Park opens and when Elliott Bay Connections is complete, the city, people in Seattle will be able to enjoy 50 acres of public space, lots of green, that runs for 3.5 miles. And that idea of sort of, again, taking a page from the Seattle Center, which I think we all think of as that shared space for Seattle, but making a shared space along the Salish Sea, which is where Seattle came from. And every human who ever resided in this region, right, has that connection to the sea.
And so this Elliott Bay Connections, was there a certain group of people that this emerged? Was it someone's around kitchen table, or where was the actual, the genesis, the moment where it all kind of springs to life?
Yeah, the genesis really came from the philanthropists. Melinda French Gates was the initial philanthropist who has lived in Seattle for many decades, very much understands the importance of green and blue for everyone in the city, and wanted really to enhance kind of all what is happening around parks and public space in Seattle. So that was kind of the impetus for that. I was lucky to be invited to help think through what we could do, and then to work, actually met Marshall years ago, and he's helped guide, and then folks at the Friends, and then of course Mayor Harrell and his administration, as well as Sam Cho, the leader of the port, and the whole port staff. So it really has been a generative process that came really out of the impulse from some philanthropists who quite honestly wanted to give back. And together with Melinda French Gates, Mackenzie Scott, the Diller Family Foundation, and Expedia, because of course, as we were talking a minute before we all got on, one of the great sort of unheralded public spaces on the waterfront already is just to the north of Centennial Park, and that's the beach at Expedia that was built and just like Pier 62, kind of opened during COVID, and is this gorgeous naturalistic public space with unbelievable views back to the city. So that's sort of Expedia's role. So it came out of a group of philanthropists, and all the work that we're describing is work that is entirely funded by private philanthropy at no cost to the taxpayer.
So what's the total budget for that private part of it?
$45 million in construction.
Got it. Okay. And then for the overall project, Elliott Bay Connections, everything we're talking about along the waterfront, the various partnerships with the port and with the city and everything, is there a price tag for that entire? And this can be for any.
What I just described, so the Greenway and the restoration and revitalization of those two parks, that's the $45 million number. And I think Joyce and Marshall spoke to the overall investment in Waterfront Park. And then, of course, if you look at the amount of public investment over the years, of course, the aquarium project, the seawall, right? Right. This is really an epic pivot point in the
Pretty
history
unprecedented. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a little, I think Joy said it before, about 780 million of money in the Waterfront Seattle piece. And that's a lot of infrastructure, roadway, drainage, utilities, all that in addition to the park. And then if you add everything up and you think about the seawall and you think about the deep bore tunnel and all that, you're upwards of $4 billion of reinvestment down there.
Yeah, and that will pay off obviously over decades and centuries in a lot of ways in terms of the. I mean, these aren't just investments for this next couple of years. These are long-term investments, which I think most people understand the importance of that. In terms of the timeline and sort of what's under construction right now, what are some things we can look forward to in the immediate sort of 6 to 12 to 18 month horizon? Who wants to talk about that?
Marshall, that's you, right?
I mean, I'll say a little bit, and I'm kind of standing in for Angela Brady, who I'm sure a lot of you all know at the Waterfront office. And Joy, please jump in too. But I think the big next things you'll see are the continuing completion of the public promenade. I can't tell you how gratifying it is to me to finally see the park parts coming online. And we're just over the last few weeks started planting the first of the actual promenade trees and plantings that are going in now that the roadway is finished and the basic geometry of the park has been done. So you're going to start seeing that this fall take shape. And then as we get into, kind of next year and into next summer, we'll be looking at where's the aquarium with its project and completion, thinking about the Overlook Walk and it's nearing completion. And then also the completion of everything on the south end in Pioneer Square with the Pioneer Square Habitat Beach and being able to get the Washington Street boat landing open and some of those connections. And then ultimately, with all the east-west streets, with Pike and Pine, with the Pioneer Square connections to the waterfront, Bell Street on the north, which connects in for Belltown, those all get completed in early 25.
So everything's done.
A steady drumbeat of projects continuing.
So it's all done by 2 years from now. It's all the ribbons cut and everybody's celebrating. It's all just 2 years from now. Is that all? That seems really quick to me.
Less than 2 years, actually. I think we're talking about Q1 of 25, which is in the middle of the winter. So I think we're kind of thinking about what it means to do the pre-events and the ribbon cutting in the winter and the rain. But I also think it's kind of how do you make that a real local experience of joy, and then really thinking about a grand opening season in the summer and fall of 2025. So I think to Marshall's point, I think the main thing is for those of you who've had to live through this construction for so long and perhaps wondering if it really was going to take shape after many years, every day you're really seeing that transformation. So trees literally have gone into Marshall's point in this last couple of weeks. The actual planting beds have been contained and put up. And so you're really seeing the cycle track is taking shape. There's a lot that's actually happening. On the southern part of the park, to Marshall's point, there's two spaces, Railroad Way and Stadium Plaza, which butt up right against the stadium district, will be coming online kind of late part of the year, early part of 2024. And Habitat Beach opened this summer, but to Marshall's point, it will be formally completed with a piece of Indigenous art, really recognizing the history and the significant history of that place for Indigenous people who were pushed out of Seattle in the early mid 1800s. But that beach has been a really amazing place to remind people about touching the water and really reminding what this waterfront once looked like for Coast Salish people. And we'll be having some smaller celebrations to bring people in to actually experience it and come back downtown and really rediscover the waterfront, which I think is really part of this excitement too, is inviting people to come down, have an experience, go back into Pioneer Square, go to the market, enjoy themselves in the rest of downtown, because I think we really want to bring people in to see how much has really come to life. And when the grand opening season happens and all the years subsequent to that, World Cup, many, many other things, it's going to be a cultural heartbeat of our city and going to be a real centerpiece and how we really begin to ground a lot of our cultural celebrations in places where people really gather.
And you mentioned, the cultural aspects of this and telling stories that are critical that haven't necessarily been thoroughly or properly told before. What does that look like for the work that Friends of Waterfront Seattle have done?
One of the things that we're really committed to, that if we're centering, a lot of our work is centering Indigenous voices in this project. We are on Coast Salish land. It's very important that we honor that and recognize that there are many stories and people that came before us, but who are still here and very much part of our community. as well as communities whose stories haven't been told. So we started a Waterfront Histories project. If you go to our website, Waterfront Park Seattle has been about elevating stories of communities who have been part of this living waterfront. So between Indigenous voices, both historic and current, Chinese American voices, because Chinese exclusion happened on our waterfront, also in the mid 1800s, but also stories of perseverance and joy in the city. So we see ourselves in a more fuller lens. And I think we have the opportunity to continue to provide a much deeper and richer narrative of this place. And I think belonging happens when you both see yourself in public space. Think about your favorite places you go to a park. It is about seeing your community and yourself in those spaces, along with that sense of safety. But it's also about acknowledging what is the realm of stories and pain and richness of cities. And that's many, many stories, but often narratives were not defined by the people who were most impacted. And so we are continually elevating the stories through our partnerships through a number of different organizations, Wanawari, the Black Spatial Project, Wing Museum, others who've been doing the work to elevate the stories, but often they haven't maybe been part of sort of mainstream Seattle sort of headlines. And I think in that is a embracing of who we are as a community and being able to continue to deepen and see ourselves in this place.
Yeah, and that similar work has been going on at Seattle Center for a long time. And Marshall, I want to come back to this notion of Seattle Center managing the waterfront now, parts of the waterfront, which is, I mean, in some ways, that's kind of a radical thing to expand Seattle Center's mission and property it's managing. How did that come about, and what's the connection? What's the analog between Seattle Center and the future of the waterfront?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to talk about that. I want to make just one kind of side note on what
Sure.
you was saying.
Of course.
I'm really enjoying this. Now that I'm here, it gives me a little bit of distance to also reflect on the partnership and what's made this project so unique. And something that I've really seen a deepening and a richness that Friends has been bringing over the last couple years. In a lot of ways, our civic partnership was very strong out of the gate in a classic kind of civic partnership model with a lot of civic leaders and people who were well known in the community as leaders who stepped up to make this project possible with the public sector and the other pieces. Now what's happening with Friends is so interesting. They're deepening, they're diversifying the way that they're partnering. We've got the tribes in there. We've got all these different local arts organizations and others who are bringing the program to the park. And it's totally changing the nature of the partnership and making it much more interesting in a lot of ways. And I just think it's so cool to watch how that's deepening. And frankly, now Seattle Center is learning from Friends also about how to do community partnerships in some new ways. We've been doing those for a long time here, but I think we're learning some things about different ways of bringing people to the table. To your question, so really, I think the focal point of what made it happen for us to come into the picture, we had, as part of designing the waterfront, a very careful, kind of thoughtful approach to studying all the best projects around the country. Who was doing a great job, not only of designing and building, but of maintaining well. And so we were constantly scanning great projects. And one of the ones we looked at a lot was a project Leslie knows well, Governor's Island in New York, Millennium Park, obviously the High Line in New York, many other spaces I could talk about. But we also studied Seattle Center. And what we learned, and this was from Robert Nellums, the former director, was that they had this special sauce here of integrating programming, maintenance, and public safety in one integrated team that thought about nothing else except for this campus, and woke up and came to work every day and thought about this place. And that was really the focal point. And a team who was very tight-knit and knew every square inch. And we realized, as much as we saw great things elsewhere, that actually Seattle Center was a good local model of how to be a very good partner in maintenance. And so the city has a group called the Central Waterfront Oversight Committee that oversees the operations of the park. That was created out of the planning of all this to make sure we did a good job of living up to the commitments on operations. They actually helped us sort of make a big pivot to ask Seattle Center to step into that role. And that took place in 2022. Mayor Harrell was very visionary and willing to step out and help make that happen for Seattle Center to grow into that. And then basically in early 23, we kind of set the ball in motion. And so it's required Seattle Center to grow a whole new limb to have a whole new waterfront team and about 25 new staff who are dedicated to making that park successful. And we started in July. And Joy and I can tell you stories. It's as with any new assignment, there have been bumps along the way, but I think we're really figuring it out as we get deeper into it. And it's fascinating for us as an organization. We have not, in our 61 years here, been asked to do anything beyond the campus at a large scale. So there's also a lot of pride that people are feeling that, yeah, we're doing something well. We're being asked to take on a new responsibility. So it's a good thing. It's very healthy for Seattle Center to help us grow.
Yeah, and the energy at Seattle Center in the last several years, I'm not sure how many years, is amazing. I love how much is going on there, in the sense of the vibrancy and the diversity of the resident organizations and what the city brings to it. I mean, it's a great model. And you mentioned this a little bit, but maybe Leslie and Joy could talk about some of these other projects in other parts of the country that might give a glimpse of what we can look forward to in Seattle in terms of program spaces, programs taking place, and kind of transformation of previously industrial or other kinds of spaces. Are there some models we can look to that share good examples of what to look forward to here on the waterfront in Seattle?
Well, I can certainly speak. I've had the great privilege, as Marshall alluded to, of working on a project on this side of the country where I am today, although I'm in Seattle a lot of the time. And that's not just Governor's Island, but actually another project called Brooklyn Bridge Park. And Brooklyn Bridge Park, in a very close sort of analog, right? It was abandoned industrial piers, cut off from the life of the city, and transformed in phases into park. But what's so beautiful about that park is that there's so many different things to do. There's sports, there's gathering places, there's kayaking. It's not a one size fits all. It's larger than this 50 acres we've been talking about. It's about 90 acres, but it stretches along. And it's been amazing, as someone who lives in Brooklyn, not just someone who works in public space, to see how it's completely changed, together with Governor's Island and other places, New York City's relationship to its own water, right, which is a riverfront, not as deep and sort of meaningful perhaps as the Salish Sea and Elliott Bay. Another project that I think about that I had played a small role in Detroit, the Detroit riverfront. Detroit, very different, very similar city to Seattle in certain ways. People drive their cars and they come to their shared space, which is the riverfront, and people come from all over the city to walk together, right? Because and to Marshall's earlier point, right, public safety, very important. And they're now building their next phase, which is a 25-acre park, happens to be designed by the same designer as Brooklyn Bridge Park. But what you're seeing around the country, actually around the world, is exactly what you talked about at the beginning, right? To go from loading dock to front porch or to living room, and the reclamation of waterfronts, and riverfronts, bayfronts, not just lakefronts, but really you're seeing cities turn themselves around, and what's interesting historically, and not as much true for Seattle, but not only were these working places, but they were the places where people turned their back, right? So in New York City, if you come to New York City, you'll notice that many of the hospitals are very far east near the East River. And why is that? Because the river was not a place of vitality, right? And hospitals in the 19th century were not a place where you went to give birth and come out, right? So, and islands like Governor's Island, a military base, other islands have cemeteries for people who did not have proper burials. So the urban water's edge was not a place of, as Joy said, of joy and of celebration for really much of its history. It was dirty, industrial, abandoned in many, many cities. And that is really what we've seen the last quarter century around the world. And it's exciting to see Seattle play such a leadership role, is really a total inversion of cities, so that the water. And I can say honestly, because I lived in Seattle for a long time, Seattle inspired what we did on Governor's Island. My experience of ferries, people didn't know what a ferry was in New York City, except for the Staten Island ferry when we started our work in 2006. And when I would say, well, there's these ferries and you can take them and go from island to island, people thought I was crazy. And I was like, no, people in Seattle are way ahead of you. Bumbershoot. There were lots of lessons learned. And I think that's also an exciting part of what's going on in public space around the world, is that, just as Marshall said, right, there's a lot of learning coming across from different parks, from different cities, from different countries, because I think we all have that same impulse. We all want to touch the water and we all want to experience green. It's primal. Every human wants to do it. And it's exciting to see cities embrace that and make that available to everyone.
Joy, what about you?
Yeah, I'd love
projects.
to Leslie's comment. I actually was in New York for 10 years and watched the High Line come to life and Brooklyn Bridge Park come to life because I lived in Brooklyn and was very disappointed when everyone discovered how beautiful it was because it was my backyard. But I think that reality, I think that the reminder for me living in Seattle of amazing parks, we have an amazing park system of neighborhood parks, but to go to a city like New York where the High Line came online, reclaiming old infrastructure as that example, and then Brooklyn Bridge Park and so many others since then that have really taken shape to remind us that quality of life in cities are also built around public space and who can access them. And that question of, if you privatize cities, then where is the place you can have the commons and bring people together? Parks and public space really allow for that. I think also the trend that we're seeing though since the High Line were the lessons of you can build and have this massive amount of investment, which is extraordinary. And I think we know the impact of a project of that scale. But the learnings of that is a network called the High Line Network, which really is also responding to what is also the implications of that kind of investment when you don't engage community. There's a huge amount of displacement that happened in the meatpacking district and all along that neighborhood, because when you bring that kind of value of a public investment like that, there will be people who are impacted, displacement, gentrification. And so we are part of a High Line network, both Waterfront Park is, but a project that I worked on in San Francisco called the Presidio Tunnel Tops, part of the Golden Gate National Recreational Area, was a similar story here in Seattle. They had their 89 earthquake, a double-decker highway called Doyle Drive that led from the Golden Gate Bridge down past the Presidio, a 1,200 now national park in the middle of San Francisco. There was a vision to open up that park that basically only had views for people who were in the military post when it became a national park. And after that earthquake, there was a vision to take down that highway, sounds familiar, and actually build 2 tunnels, put the highway under those tunnels and build a 14-acre urban park that now connects the Presidio's main post, if you know, but the Presidio and Crissy Field. It opened in the summer of 2021. And I think the centering of all this in that particular area is this completion of all these military posts in the Bay Area to parks. But it's also this larger connection of who does it belong to and who actually sees themselves in it. It's probably the highest maybe income zip code in the entire San Francisco. So the question was, who are you building this for? I think that question can be asked too of the waterfront. So that similar ask of, we can build extraordinary places, but this larger question of how we do placemaking is a really important element. And I think that lens of learning of how we trust and listen to community and how we center who we actually are inviting into the placemaking itself will be the continual work that we'll be doing. These are going to be cultural spaces, and I think that's the reminder. The tunnel tops brought 1 million people to the park in a full year of opening, which I think the original sort of estimates were 500,000. So the fact that we have an estimate of 15 million people on this waterfront that are locals, but also are people who will love to come to downtown, come to the waterfront, it'll be the heart and push people back downtown into Pioneer Square and to Pike Place Market, and to see all these other parts of our city that have been disconnected by this old infrastructure that was really not meant to be a human-centered design. The 1950s sort of infrastructure projects really created that disconnection. And I think more than ever since pandemic, we need to be in community. We are human, despite the fact we are on a screen, and we've all learned to sort of be in rectangular boxes on screens. But I also think this city deserves to have a place that people can really gather and really have a vision for the city that's really dynamic and important.
Yeah, and not to defend the viaduct, but it did take Highway 99 off of 4th Avenue back in 1951 or whatever. So it was appreciated there for at least a little while. Yeah. I love this notion of this huge public investment in a permanent space that can be enjoyed forever. I mean, I don't think we've done anything even close to this since Seattle Center was built and parceled together from some other previous existing civic structures. So this is, there's been big events have been held in Seattle over the last several decades that brought people here for short periods of time and kind of gave the city a boost around the world. But I love the notion of this is being built. This is it's for tourists and for residents. And it's the timing as the pandemic is wrapping up, knock on wood, everything like that, is pretty amazing to have this new resource in downtown Seattle for people to look forward to fully opening in 2025. Couple questions. just maybe this is already answered. Is the construction already fully funded, or are there sort of fiscal headwinds between now and 2025? Who's that question for?
I would say I would say that the public elements are funded and contracted. Joy, you might want to speak a little bit about your campaign and where things are there. But yeah, I mean, it's fully underway.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
So Friends is leading the campaign for Waterfront Park. It's a $170 million project. We have raised now $130 million. And part of the announcement that you may have read about the Elliott Bay Connections project was also an extraordinary, two extraordinary gifts that came from the Gates Foundation, a challenge grant for $10 million. And Mackenzie Scott also made a gift of $10 million to the campaign because of this real connectivity of experience of all of this public space, and a real nod to how historic Waterfront Park will be, but also how we have this moment in our city to really bring to life some of the most extraordinary parts of our waterfront to the public. So we are inviting people in to be part of this work. We'll be completing the campaign in June of 2025 and celebrating both its opening and also people who've given extraordinary gifts of time and treasure to this project, and inviting the community to be part of that. And Friends will continue to be the nonprofit partner who'll be raising funds to maintain this project. We've committed $5 million as part of our partnership with the Seattle Center, because part of that public-private partnership is we've been solving for the things that we couldn't have anticipated. 2019, you wouldn't have asked the question of this level of public safety that's been needed downtown. But again, I think that when you have this model of public-private partnership, it's important to solve for the things that we needed to be able to ensure that this park would be an extraordinary experience for anyone who comes down here, that it'd be clean, it would be cared for, and it'd be operated at the highest standard of which Seattle Center has an incredible reputation for. So we are looking to finish this campaign, and we have a lot of great excitement and enthusiasm. And then talking about the extension of the Elliott Bay Connections project is just another part of the larger story that's really extraordinary.
Yeah, and let's talk about the public safety aspect of it too, because there's always there's not like a dark side, but that's a concern of some people. Of once it's all built and hopefully there's money to maintain it and keep it, do all the maintenance required over the many decades of its life. What are the concerns about public safety, and how are those being addressed as part of the overall plan?
That is top of mind. I can't even tell you. I would say, Joy, you could share, when we talk with supporters about this project, I think this is the fundamental question most people have is, yes, we love the design. We're excited to see it finished. How's it going to feel 5 years in? How's it going to feel on a rainy Thursday after, well, this is a beautiful sunny day. It's not raining today, but when it's not peak season and we have huge events happening. So that's a big part of what we're hoping to bring as Seattle Center. And frankly, why we, with the partnership we have, Friends saw the opportunity to support that model, and they stepped up as they have repeatedly to help make things happen beyond even the capital campaign they're delivering. The thing we're doing, which I think is a little unique in the city, and it's what we do here at Seattle Center, is we have a dedicated team who are public safety officers who bridge, they engage, they intervene to manage a code of conduct. They can also bring in social service support, and they can bring in SPD and SFD when they need to. So they're this bridging function, and they are actually trained as law enforcement. They have the ability to manage, to intervene in a firm way when they need to, but they're trained to de-escalate, and they're trained to meet people where they are. The key thing is they're not thinking about the whole city at once. They're thinking about Waterfront Park, and they're walking a beat. They're on the ground. They see what is happening. They get to know the community. If there's particular people who need extra support, we get to know them. We get to know their needs. Sometimes we know where people are with their medication. That's something that comes up all the time. So that's what we're doing here at Seattle Center. It happens quietly. When I talk to my chief of security, he's having a good day when his work is invisible. Nobody has to think about what he's doing because it's being done well and everybody feels welcome and safe in the space. And that's what we're aiming for on the waterfront as well. It is really different. Seattle Center has clear edges. It's a campus. We've done it for 60 plus years. So the waterfront is way more porous. It's very spread out from the stadiums and Railroad Way all the way up to Pike Place Market. So it's a more challenging geography, frankly. But the partnership is what makes it work. And the fact that Friends helps us bring social service into the picture, and we have a good relationship with SPD when we need it.
Yeah, I mean, the public-private partnerships are key to all of this happening. I mean, none of this would happen if there wasn't this, and hopefully that continues beyond the operational phase where there's just not necessarily accountability, but just that dialogue and that concern and the fact that it's not just shunted off to the side and forgotten about. Leslie, I know a lot of the designs are already done and a lot of the work has already been penciled out, and the stuff that's being built obviously is already, that's all cooked. But with the Elliott Bay Connections project, there are some still opportunities for people to actually participate in the planning and that's something. You have a survey that's up. Did you want to talk about your survey that you have?
Absolutely. So there is no design yet, and it's important to emphasize that this is a really restoration and revitalization project for public parks that are owned by the city and the Port of Seattle and already enjoyed by thousands and thousands of people, whether they're commuting by bike, going for a run, enjoying the spectacular sunset. So this is not a blank slate. But there is no design. Walker Macy, a landscape firm based in Seattle that's worked on many parks, including right now working on both Steinbrook and Freeway Park, are the landscape designers. They led a session last night with public input, and we have a survey up, and I think the DSA kindly put that link, and we really encourage people to give us their reactions in that survey. And then as Walker Macy integrates those ideas and comes up with some concept design, they will be back out looking for more feedback, but with the more fun part of presenting some designs, because there are no designs yet. So there's a lot of opportunity to give feedback into these restoration and revitalization of these already well-used and well-loved parks.
Okay, and that's in the chat. And let's see, where's the link? It's in the Q&A. Yeah. Okay, there it is. So you can participate in that survey. One thing we talked about a little bit about Seattle Center's role on the waterfront and this notion of these resident organizations. Because there's some big players on the waterfront who are there one way or the other, whether it's the Seattle Art Museum with a sculpture park or Seattle Aquarium, the different various private businesses and everything. How's that all managed now? I mean, one thing is, one of the questions in the box was if some of those other projects have been fully funded. Is the aquarium project fully funded at this point? Do we know? Anybody?
They are, yes, they are in construction. They're advancing the project.
Okay.
As is often the case, I think they have more work to finish their campaign, but you move the project forward, and that's being done in partnership with the Waterfront program and the Parks Department. So yes, they're very much on track.
Okay. And so then, a couple of years down the road, when there's all these things are finished and Elliott Bay Connections there and everything, will there be one entity kind of managing the whole place? Is that Seattle Center's role, or is it going to be a little more organic than that?
Yeah.
Did you think of that? No, I'm just kidding.
Leslie, you can speak to Elliott Bay Connections, but I will say Seattle Center hopes to be long-term on Waterfront Park in terms of our role.
I was just thinking about the different needs of sharks versus sculptures. And so certainly when you think just of the two of the anchors that you just mentioned, Felix, right? The aquarium, and with that beautiful sort of Oculus window. So we'll all be able to experience that. And of course, the Olympic Sculpture Park is free and open to the public. So I think it's really much more about collaboration and sort of shared space, right? This idea, and in some ways, I think we all don't really fully realize what there is on the waterfront already and how this sort of green connection can bring it all together, right? Unbelievable art, unbelievable sea life, right? And backed up by extraordinary research at the aquarium. And then just the opportunity and the Pike Place Market, and that overlook, which, both integrates the aquarium, but also makes that connection, right? Between, again, when we think of the icons of Seattle, right? It has to be, with all due respect to the Seattle Center, I think it's neck and neck, right? The Pike Place Market and the Seattle Center as the icons we think of now that the pink, well, I can't talk about the car wash being gone because I'm too sad.
The sign's still there. The smaller of the two neon signs is still there. Yeah.
Oh, the bigger ones at Mohi, but I'm just saying that was my icon when I moved to Seattle long ago. So, but in all seriousness, when you think about that, what other city has like this extraordinary market, aquarium, art, and then this whole connection where people will be able to bike, roll, walk, and green for 3.5 miles, right? There's not a lot of waterfronts that can compete with that when this is all done. And I think that's what's exciting. And it's really more about collaboration than it is about which entity. And I think the other thing, and Joy, you talked about this a little bit, but I think really important, this is a really important moment for Seattle, right? And Mayor Harrell is really leading these efforts about what is a city when it's, without its downtown, right? It's the place we all go to, however we get downtown, to be together. It's been, we all acknowledge, right? It's been a hard few years for downtowns everywhere, right? All around the world. And so this idea that parks and green space are going to be one of the magnets to bring people downtown. And that's why for us, DSA is the perfect partner for Elliott Bay Connections, because they've really been the folks who have been here downtown all along, and helping, advocate for not just the businesses, but the tens of thousands of people who live in downtown, right? Which wasn't true back in the day, 61 years ago. Sorry, now everyone knows how old I am. When Space Needle was built, right? That wasn't Seattle. People didn't live downtown back then, and now lots of people do, and lots of people come to downtown. And that's, I think, what a lot of what this is all about.
Yeah, and it's a very different way of doing business than when Seattle Center was planned, more than 60 years ago. They just condemned a neighborhood and, moved in, bowled those things down and kind of built up the civic campus around it. And that's just the way things were done back then. This obviously reflects more levels of engagement, more complex, more emotional intelligence around the engagement, which ultimately results in a much better product, of course. Now, let's see, just a few minutes left here in our conversation, but I wanted to talk about other along with public safety, which, as you said, Marshall, sort of, top of mind, job one. Are there other potential headwinds or pitfalls or things that we're not thinking about in all the joy and gleeful parts of this, all the celebratory sunny days and on the waterfront? Are there other elements that are sort of on your list of things that are concerns about this, or that you guys are looking at as you prepare to make this a successful project?
I would just say, oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just thinking about what Joy said about fire pits. One of the things that people, and I've been involved in a lot of park projects, they only show summer, right? And guess what? We're coming up on that day, right? The shortest day of the year. And we know how short it is in Seattle, December 21st. And parks are places, especially in a city like Seattle, where you want to be there all year round, right? And so thinking about those features, whether it's lighting, whether it's fire pits, we don't just want to be inside our houses in the dark of winter. And so that's something I think that field operations, James Corner, thought about in the design of Waterfront Park, something we're thinking about in the restoration of these parks, right? Which is, how are they places that we all come out of our houses to enjoy, even when it's dark and even when it's rainy, right? And that is important. That's not a concern, but I think it's a sign of a successful public space that it is really used 12 months of the year.
Something I'll add to that, and I've gotten a lot more aware of since coming over to Seattle Center, is, a lot of what's driving the renaissance with our parks in downtown and Seattle Center's renaissance is the arts and culture sector. It's music, it's art, it's organizations coming into Pier 62 and breathing their life into it and bringing their community to it. And that's what's happening on the campus with the return of Bumbershoot and the Bite. But the arts and culture sector in Seattle is in very dire straits. We don't have a reliable way to provide enough public support. Their models for how they make money as nonprofit organizations through subscriptions, through their events. And I'm not just talking about the opera and the ballet here. I'm talking about and the symphony. I'm talking about the whole ecology of arts and culture organizations. People aren't coming out in the ways they used to. They're still coming out, but the level of support isn't the same. And frankly, some of the philanthropic support they've relied on pre-pandemic isn't there. If that sector continues to struggle and can't sustain itself, keeping these parks vital and successful and interesting and attractive is a lot harder to do. So I just would bring that into the picture too, is we need a vibrant arts and culture sector who is part of what makes these downtown spaces thrive, and the institutions that are part of making those spaces thrive.
Yeah,
That's
I would also
point,
add to that. I mean, I think that we have still a struggle of people who haven't come back downtown really since pandemic. So I think the headlines that were pretty that were pretty horrific are still in people's minds. I think we're still recovering from what COVID did for all of us. But for those of us who are always down here and downtown a lot, we know that things have shifted and we know that the energy is changing, right? I think that part of it is that narrative to Marshall's point is our downtown isn't going to come back in the same way, but through arts, culture, sports, and an amazing public space that's going to bring huge vitality economically to downtown and our region, but also bring people together for an experience that we've never had, a downtown park that never quite got to the start line as close as we've been, right? So I do really want to acknowledge that part of our commitment, and the only work that we could do is in partnership with the DSA of hosting events to build that confidence so that we know the word of mouth of you should come downtown. It does feel different. Things aren't what they were in 2020. That is still something a lot of cities are really struggling with. I think Seattle isn't struggling perhaps as some other West Coast cities that we know are really having a hard time of people returning to work, but also coming downtown for experiences. I mean, the fact that we have our stadium district on the south end of the park, and then you have Seattle Center, there's really and downtown, a triangular sort of connection. But it is about this sort of promise of something that's sort of extraordinary, and things are really changing down here. And so we don't take for granted how much we're part of that solve. We're part of that renaissance of downtown and a commitment for people to come back and rediscover it. And it's going to take all of us to keep getting there.
Yeah, and that's a great point about the arts and culture sector, and that renaissance is critical too. And how fortunate we are in the timing that this project was in the works prior to the pandemic, and then is coming to fruition at this era, at this age where, Seattle's growing as more than 100,000 people live downtown now, and that number is only going to grow with a resource like along the waterfront like this. Just a couple seconds left here. If you had to pick one of the most favorite thing when the new park is open and running, what's going to be your favorite spot to visit that will be that you won't tell other people about? Just between the four of us here, what would be your favorite spot to visit that you won't want to overrun with other tourists or locals? Go ahead. Who wants to go first? We got about 30 seconds to do this whole process here.
I think it's going to be the Overlook Walk. Yeah, which is
okay.
the big elevated 1 acre connection from Pike Place Market that brings you gradually down to the waterfront and have these extraordinary 360-degree views at the same height of the former viaduct. So a bit of a nod to the history. And it will be the hashtag, so.
Very nice. Anybody, Marshall
I was going to say the very beginning of the Overlook, where you come out from the market and you get to step out from that and get a 270-degree view of the whole waterfront. I think that's going to have people's jaws on the floor when they have that experience. And it's coming up. It's not far off in the future.
All right. Leslie, just thumbs up from you since we're out of time otherwise.
Thumbs up, and then I'm waiting to touch the water in one of those restored beach coves too.
Very nice.
Later, 2026. But that's the other payoff.
Well, thanks you guys for the work you're doing on this project and these multiple projects. It's obviously key to the near future and the distant future of Seattle and the past, present, everything all wrapped up. I want to thank our panelists, Seattle Center Director Marshall Foster, Leslie Koch, consultant with the Elliott Bay Connections Project, and Joy Shigaki, President and CEO of Friends of Waterfront Seattle. Oh, and be sure and check out the Elliott Bay Connections survey in the box there. And I want to thank all of our audience members for joining us today for this edition of DSA Virtual Access. I want to thank, as always, the fabulous DSA staff, John Scholes, Sally Wright, James Cito, and Lacey McKeever. Of course, the holiday season is upon us. The white lights are on the trees. The fun and activities and traditions in downtown Seattle all begin officially next week. First and foremost is DSA's downtown tree lighting celebration next Friday, November 24th. That's already 1 week from tomorrow, believe it or not. All the details are online at downtownseattle.org. Until then, I'm Felix Bonnell on behalf of DSA. Thanks again for joining us this morning. Have a great Thanksgiving, and we will see you downtown.